And joining us now on the debate in Palo Alto, California, David Kennedy, professor of history at Stanford University and the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, 1929 to 45. In Washington, D.C., Russ Roberts, professor of economics at George Mason University. And here in studio, Eric Lascelles, chief economic and rate strategist at TD Securities, and Joe Martin, director of Canadian business history at the Rotman School of Management at the U of T. Good to have everybody, both here in studio and in Points Beyond on our program. David Kennedy, as we revisit the New Deal, I'm sure we have some viewers who remember it firsthand, but I suspect we have many, many more who don't. So give us the nuts and bolts. What was the New Deal?
Well, the New Deal, first of all, is something that happened in the context of the Great Depression of the 1930s. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, the unemployment rate was 25%, the worst since anybody has kept those kinds of numbers. And it's customary to think of the New Deal in three parts, like Gaul, as concerned with relief from the immediate crisis of the Depression, recovery from the Depression, and reform, that is the lasting legacy of institutions that the New Deal left. And I think most historians would probably grade the New Deal somewhat favorably on the count of relief, that it provided short-term relief to some millions of people who were unemployed, gave a psychological lift to the country. Most historians would say as a recovery program, the New Deal was a pretty dismal failure because the Depression went on for 8 more years after Roosevelt was elected. But on the count of reform, I think most people would agree that the New Deal was a rather considerable success, that it left a whole latticework of institutions on which the society and the economy prospered for at least 2 generations after World War II.
Okay, we're going to basically spend the next half an hour pulling apart the New Deal and seeing what did work and what didn't work. Russ Roberts, let me bring you in. In terms of what's still in place today, what was passed under the New Deal that we still see today?
Well, probably one of the most important things was Social Security, which was passed in 1935, which has been a rousing success, most would say, although some might say it's too early to tell. It was basically a government-sponsored Ponzi scheme, right? It's a way to pay money to old folks based on the payments of young people, and because of demographics today, that program is perhaps going to contribute to some serious problems in the next 10 or 20 years. A lot of the problems we face today were born in the New Deal financially. They worked very well for a lot of America's history. Recently, they haven't done so well. The FDIC, the guarantee of bank payments by the government, was passed during the New Deal and has been a great success, although recently we've struggled with that. Fannie Mae was born in the New Deal, although it became, at the time, it was purely public, and it was semi-privatized in 1968, and now is part of this mess we're in as well. So there's a whole mix of programs that survived the New Deal. Those, I'd say, were 3 of the most important for today's terms.
Okay, Joe Martin, we hear 2 terms a lot today as we make comparisons between the two. Fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. Which, in your view, more accurately describes the New Deal?
Oh, I would say fiscal stimulus.
Because?
Yeah. Well, because in the U.S., as distinct from Canada, they went about spending more money, maybe not as much as they should have, but they attempted to grease the wheels by public works and other methods, whereas in Canada, we really did nothing under either administration.
Eric, would you agree with that?
I certainly would agree with that. Fiscal stimulus really was, to some extent, the only option there. Monetary policy wasn't so much something you could change at the time. The gold standard was the approach at the time. Currencies were fixed, and as a result, monetary policy, interest rates, couldn't really be changed on a whim. And now that did change a little bit over the span of the New Deal, but at the beginning, really, you only had one lever to pull, and that was fiscal policy.
Okay, let us try to figure out what worked and what didn't in a little more detail. And to do that, let me also welcome to our discussion now Lee Ohanian, who's a professor of economics at UCLA, and he joins us on the line from Los Angeles. Lee, let's put you to work right away. Did the New Deal, in your view, succeed at what it was attempting to do?
The primary goal of the New Deal was to restore employment. And from that perspective, it didn't succeed. In 1933, when Roosevelt took office, hours worked per capita were about 27% below their 1929 level before the Depression started. In 1939, they were still down 22%, despite the number of government programs to try to create jobs. So from that perspective, employment wasn't restored, Americans weren't back at work, unemployment remained very, very high. And the primary reason that employment remained very low is because of New Deal policies that kept wages way, way above normal in many sectors of the economy. And when wages are too high, there'll just be not very many people hired at those wages.
David Kennedy, let me get you to weigh in on this. Of course, Lee is well known in the United States for having written a new paper that tries to re-examine what in his view would be a mythology around the New Deal, that it was all wonderful and we have it to thank for the fact that capitalism was saved. So where are you on this issue of whether or not it worked or didn't?
Well, one bit of, since you used the term, I'll use it too, mythology, we just heard, and that is that the primary goal of the New Deal was to restore employment. I think that was the ostensibly primary goal of the New Deal, but I think its deeper purposes, and Franklin Roosevelt's deeper purposes, was not simply to end this transient economic crisis, but to use the moment when the American political system, which is notoriously inoperable to effect major reforms, to use this moment of crisis to change the landscape of the American economy. We just heard some of the institutions that came into being there, including FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and Social Security. I would add the Securities and Exchange Commission to that list. And those institutions became the new landscape on which American society lived for generations afterwards.
Joe, how about it? Did it succeed in doing what it was attempting to do?
Well, I like Professor Kennedy's book very, very much. More recently, I've read Amity Schleye's new work on the Great Depression, and she got me thinking. So I compared economic performance in Canada and the United States, and I would characterize the 30s as in the United States having two activist presidents, Hoover and FDR.
You put Hoover in the activist camp.
Very much so. Certainly Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley was an act. It may have been a bad act, but it was an act. Okay. And in Canada, two non-activist prime ministers, Bennett and King, one conservative, one liberal. But from 1933 to 1940, and that's the time period I chose, the Canadian economy significantly outperformed the American economy, and there was no fiscal stimulus until the very, very end when we were starting to get ready for the war.
So you would say that it was good that we didn't go down the path of the New Deal as the Americans did?
Yes, but I would also say that what FDR did, and I think we're going to get to this soon, is that he gave a great sense of confidence not only to the American people but to the Canadian people who listened to him on the radio, and he gave an inspiration to the Canadian people that their own political leaders did not.
Okay, let's leave leadership aside for a second. Russ, again, on the issue of whether or not the New Deal achieved what it set out to achieve, how would you rate it?
Well, I want to emphasize this point about activism. Hoover also, by the way, increased spending dramatically. He also increased tax rates. He also presided over a monetary policy that was extremely contractionary at two different times, right at the beginning of the Depression and then in the 37-38 period, which brought on a second recession. So monetary policy was horribly run, as Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz have chronicled in their wonderful book, Monetary History of the United States. In terms of the hope and confidence, I think it created hope and confidence for the so-called person in the street. But for the business community, it created a great deal of uncertainty as to what the rules of the game were. And as a result, the payoff in hope and confidence never really came about until after the war for the American economy. So I do think he boosted people's spirits, but I think it was mostly an illusion in terms of economic well-being. And I think it's an important revision to history that the people have looked and seen what actually happened. Net private investment was negative all the way through the 30s, which means that businesses weren't even replacing the stuff that wore out. So there was a tremendous lack of confidence, partially caused, maybe a lot caused, by the economic environment of public policy.
Eric Lascelles, where are you on this?
Well, you know, I think I do operate somewhere in the middle. I might characterize it as a very, very qualified success. It's fair to say the problems truly didn't end until World War II began, and that's an entirely separate issue. Some of the statistics you look at suggest some improvement. It's fair to say there wasn't a whole lot of hiring that went on, but if you count government paid employees, perhaps it did go up. I think it really is a bit of a blur, but I'd almost step back and make the observation that before the New Deal began, government spending was about 3% of the economy. During the New Deal, it grew to about 10%. Today, it's about 20%, even before we talk about what Obama may or may not have. It was a step in the direction we ended up going anyways.
Lee, I'd like to bring you in and ask about reform of business practices in financial institutions. We know they attempted to accomplish some things in this area. Did they?
Certainly, you know, we've talked about the FDIC, and another goal of the New Deal was to fix the financial system. Bank runs and bank panics were rampant at that time. And the FDIC succeeded in the sense that banking panics and bank runs were ended. What that didn't do was restore lending. So I believe Russ mentioned low investment. Investment was 60% below its normal level throughout the 1930s. This, in my opinion, wasn't due to a flaw in the financial system. There just wasn't much demand for business investment because it was such a poor economic environment. My own opinion is that we would have returned to full employment by 1936 or 1937 had a number of these policies not been put in place.
It is interesting that there is a great deal of revision going on right now about the New Deal. It's been viewed basically one way for a very long time, ever since the 1930s. But we are hearing on this program here, unemployment wasn't dramatically better as a result of the New Deal. Yes, there were some new financial institutions put in place, so that was good. Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't. What about the war? Joe, World War II.
Before we get to the war,
yeah?
I'd like to ask the American colleagues of this. To my mind, from a Canadian perspective, one of the great villains was Hoover when in June of 1930 he signed Smoot-Hawley, which he did not have to do.
Agreed.
Do you want to remind everybody what Smoot-Hawley was?
Smoot-Hawley was the highest tariff known in North America at least, and it caused worldwide repercussions.
Yep.
Our trade dropped by 65%. America was our biggest supplier and also one of two biggest customers. But then Cordell Hull came in, and to my mind, he's one of my heroes because he's a person who influenced FDR to move on free trade. And that was the beginning of the free trade era, which led to, in 1947, to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. So I don't know whether they consider the trade aspect part of the New Deal, but I think it's one of the great contributions of that time period.
David, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. I mean, Roosevelt was something of an economic nationalist in his first year or so in office, but clearly his deeper instincts were internationalist, and we see the results of that in the institutions particularly that were formed at the end of the World War II period. But I would say with respect to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, it clearly was a mistake. I think that there's a huge consensus about that amongst historians and economists. It was not all Hoover's doing. The Congress kind of ran away with it, and he signed it somewhat reluctantly. And I might also say that other countries didn't have entirely clean hands in this matter. There's something called the Ottawa Agreements, after all, which created the British imperial preference system and threw up a lot of trade restricting barriers around the whole Commonwealth area. So it's not just the United States that's guilty of resorting to nationalist and trade strangling policies in this period.
But it wasn't a reaction. The Ottawa Treaty wasn't a reaction to Smoot-Hawley.
So they went
well,
first.
Fair enough.
But
many countries, it's not just the British Empire and it's not just the United States, resorted to these autarkic and self-sufficient policies. And there was a lot of conventional wisdom to the extent that, to the effect that this was the right thing to do in a crisis this severe.
I agree.
Russ, do you want to weigh in on the issue of whether or not Roosevelt gets some credit for eventually becoming the free trader that helped get us away from Smoot-Hawley?
I think that's a good point. I don't know enough about Roosevelt's actual policies, but I think Smoot-Hawley illustrates the kind of politically attractive, mistaken policies that were followed both by Hoover and by Roosevelt in the name of what seemed to be obviously a good idea. So when you're losing jobs, what could be better than protectionism to protect American jobs from foreign competition? It was a misunderstanding of how trade affects employment. Similarly, during the New Deal, here's Roosevelt slaughtering pigs. People are hungry. We're killing pigs to make sure prices stay high. We're allowing unions and industries to form cartels to keep wages and prices high, thinking, well, that'll create wealth, when in fact what creates wealth is production and innovation and risk-taking. So it's an interesting example to me of how easy it is to blunder politically.
You brought up the issue, Eric, of the war, that in spite of all of the policies brought in by the government of the United States of the day, in fact, it was World War II that turned the economy around. You want to make that argument?
Sure, briefly, you can certainly make the case that when the war began, suddenly there was a huge amount of appetite for industrial production in the U.S. Exports surged. Wars, on many occasions, have managed to rescue economies, or really to get them going in some sense, and in particular when it was one as all-encompassing as that. Really lickety-split, you saw unemployment rates through the floor, and a variety of other measures improved quite quickly as well. I don't think anyone would suggest that as a resolution to the current problems, though.
I think we get consensus on that. Who did I hear out of town come?
May I
go
comment
ahead,
on
Russ.
that?
Sure.
I just want to mention the work of Robert Higgs, who's done some really superb historical research on the effects of the war on consumption. It's very easy to get rid of unemployment during a war by conscripting people, which we did. Many of them were glad to be conscripted, of course, for a war that was seen to be a good cause. But the question is whether that government military activity, both on the labor side and the production side, the munitions production, stimulated the economy. And there's overwhelming evidence that Higgs chronicles that it did not. Per capita consumption in the United States was much lower in 1944 than it was in 1940. And I think people who lived through it can attest to the fact that it was not a very prosperous time. The data make it look prosperous because it includes the production of tanks and bombs. You can't eat tanks and bombs. An economy that creates those, and government can always increase the size of that, but that's not going to make people's lives better off. So I think it's very important to distinguish between wartime measures that increase the size of the military, which of course it did, and of course it increased the size of people who are working through government activity, either as soldiers or as war munition producers, but its effect on the private side economy was negative. War is destructive. It is a bad thing for an economy. And I think it's a very dangerous idea to think that it somehow has some stimulating positive effect.
Joe, you were a tiny baby at the time with no firsthand memories of World War II, but what do you think of what Russ has had to say?
Could I again just step one back? In context for our viewers here in Ontario, I think far too few Canadians understand that North America was much harder hit than Europe and that Canada was harder hit than the United States. Our GDP per capita from peak to trough went down by 35%, the US 30%. So let's bear that in mind when we go forward and start talking about the declines that are coming. In terms of the war, what I remember, and my British relatives say it's not true, but we had rationing. I remember rationing. And so that's one of the reasons you didn't consume, because you weren't allowed to.
Wasn't enough.
And certainly growing up in a small village in Saskatchewan, I could not buy a bottle of Coke, and I love Coke.
And you couldn't buy it because you were not allowed to?
There wasn't any. If you went to a big city like Regina, you could get Coke, but there was no Coke in rural Saskatchewan.
David Kennedy, how about the argument that World War II was perhaps more influential than the New Deal in bringing the Western world out of its economic tough times?
Well, there's no question about that whatsoever, it seems to me. And essentially it's because of the growth engines that were ignited in World War II in this country that the world economy was propelled through a 50-year-long economic expansion on such proportions that by the end of the century we had to invent a new word to describe it, and the word's globalization. I'm old enough that I remember rationing too, and I recently, in cleaning out some of my parents' effects when they abandoned their house or gave up their house, came across a lot of those old World War II ration books, and the thing that struck me was most of them are unused. Yes. Rationing was really a kind of incident of the war. It wasn't central to the American experience. The United States is the only major country that fought World War II that managed to grow its civilian economy in wartime. A really unprecedented feat in the history of warfare, largely speaking, and a singular achievement in the context of World War II.
Lee Ohanian, how about you on that?
Many point to World War II as a prime example of fiscal stimulus, generating economic recovery, putting people to work. And that episode is now being used to look at today. And what's missed in this debate is that there were a couple of other key ingredients in the wartime expansion. Perhaps most important is that a number of Roosevelt's industrial and labor policies that kept prices way too high and kept wages way too high were gradually eroded. So for example, wages in manufacturing were about 25% above their normal level in 1939. In World War II, an entity called the National War Labor Board essentially didn't allow any wage increase that was above cost of living. And in fact, there's a famous case involving Bethlehem Steel and the Steelworkers Union in which the union and Bethlehem Steel negotiated a very large wage increase. That was struck down by the National War Labor Board. That contributes substantially to increases in employment, as did enormous growth in productivity, which perhaps largely reflected government-sponsored enterprises and R&D. So when people look at federal spending generating large job growth, World War II is not the example to use. Probably at least half or perhaps 2/3 of that increase is coming from other sources rather than just the fiscal stimulus.
Well, follow up if you would. Make the case, because I know you say in your paper that you think the New Deal actually prolonged the Depression, what, as long as 6 years longer than it needed to be? Is that right? Absolutely.
Beginning in 1933, there was enormous productivity growth, which should have brought about a very, very rapid recovery. The banking system, Roosevelt did a good job with the FDIC to stop bank runs. Real interest rates were very low. deflation was over, all the seeds were in place for a very healthy and very rapid recovery. The New Deal is largely characterized by people being out of work and continuing to be out of work. And the only reason wages did not come down and let more people back to work is because policies kept them up.
Russ Roberts, what's your view on that?
Well, I think Lee is basically right, but I also think there was the uncertainty that was created by the constant erratic nature of the policy process, which is almost inevitable in a democracy, affected the environment for investment and especially for risk-taking that I think is crucial to a recovery. So I think that's part of the story as well.
David Kennedy, we heard Joe Martin say a little bit earlier in the program that, of course, the Depression, the New Deal that followed it, the war, not just an economic story, it's a political story as well. And psychologically, one of the things the New Deal did and FDR did was make people feel hopeful. Do you have to take that into account when you talk about the New Deal?
Well, certainly that's part of the collective lived memory of that period amongst the generation that experienced it in our society, in our culture, is that a feeling of hope and optimism that Roosevelt somehow, maybe somewhat mysteriously, managed to engender in the public at large. But you know, going back to the political dimension of this, I just recollect Roosevelt's second inaugural address in 1937. It's the address when he got off this famous line about, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-nourished, ill-fed," and so on. If you read that speech in context, it's clear that 1/3 of a nation that he's talking about are not the victims of this immediate crisis of the Depression. He's talking about deep structural problems that have accumulated over generations in American society. And he says something extraordinary in that speech. He brags about the economic recovery that his administration has effected since 1933. And then he says, and I can quote this almost exactly, he said, "But these signs of economic recovery may become portents of political disaster." A really extraordinary thing to say. But what he meant was that if this moment of crisis passed too soon and the malleability of the system froze up again, that he would not get his full reform program really in place, and that 1/3 of a nation would remain structurally left out of the great American barbecue.
Eric.
Yeah, well, let me jump ahead of the game a little bit here and talk about the present instance for one moment in the context of psychology, because you simply cannot make the case in the Canadian example that the Canadian economy would be doing as poorly as it is if it was just exports to the U.S., just financial market conditions. It has become increasingly evident that there is a huge psychological aspect at play, and it really is the degree to which Canadians are constantly exposed to U.S. media, to the U.S. situation. You have a situation where home prices are declining slightly here in Canada, consumers are retrenching. There really isn't a very homegrown argument for that to be happening. It is, I suppose, a continuation of this long trend of U.S. events affecting Canada in more ways than purely flows of trade.
And there's too much wannabe here, isn't there?
Unfortunately, and it seems that the wannabe goes in a negative direction, not just a positive.
Well, you've taken us nicely then to the third section of our discussion, which is about drawing parallels between what happened back in the 30s and what's happening today. Lee Ohanian, are those parallels there to be had?
You know, to put it in perspective, real gross national product, the production of all final goods and services, in 1933 was about close to 40% below its trend value. Today, GDP is down, relative to a year ago, GDP is higher. We've had about 1.5% employment loss in the last year, most of it in manufacturing and construction. In contrast, we had about 30% employment loss in the Great Depression New Deal. So there's just an enormous difference. The media does draw some parallels, and ones I can point to are the financial system was well in need of fixing in the 1930s. It is as well today. There were steps taken to fix the 1930s that didn't create new lending from banks to businesses or consumers. Today, it looks like steps have been taken to ensure interbank lending, to ensure money market accounts, to recapitalize the banking system. That has not resulted in any substantial increase in lending to businesses or to consumers. From those perspectives, there are some similarities, but the degree of the problem is just enormously different today versus the 1930s.
Joe Martin, you want to draw any parallels between then and now?
Well, I think that's a good start. And the two other differences I would point out is that we have open trade. I wouldn't mind hearing the Americans on the panel, because I'm a little bit concerned about the House of Representatives, not the President, not the Senate. And the other difference is that commodity prices. I mean, we may be complaining about $47 a barrel for oil, but the fact is the price of wheat in 1932 reached its lowest level in 300 years. And the other problem was the old laws of supply and demand. There wasn't much grown. In 1937, we only got 5 bushels of wheat per acre. So 5 bushels of wheat at a terribly low price. So those are huge differences between then and now.
David Kennedy, parallels you'd like to point out or not?
Well, the first point maybe is a technical one, but we want to be careful about the then and the now. The proper then is some date in 1930, approximately a year or some months after the stock market crash in 1929. Things didn't get really truly nasty until late 1931 and 32 and the beginning of 1933. So the then and now comparison has to be accompanied by a not yet kind of a consideration.
Oh, that's a good point.
But I would say also there are many differences between then, however we define it, and now. We're not within a decade of a hugely globally disruptive event like the character of World War I, which was the underlying structural problem that had disrupted all kinds of economies in the industrialized world, Europe and the United States alike. There's nothing like that comparable in our picture today. We have lived with an American-led free trade regime for the better part of 50 years, thanks to the WTO and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Even Americans who historically weren't all that interdigitated with the global economy before World War II have now learned to be a major player in it. So despite all I share some of the anxieties that have been expressed about the political sentiment in the House of Representatives, which has protectionist and nationalist elements in it, but I think the preponderance of sentiment in this country is rather committedly internationalist and multilateralist going forward.
Eric.
You know, I have to agree with the statement in particular. The timing is crucial here because we really are just starting to see this slowdown. Just about everyone who makes forecasts will tell you that 2009 is going to look a lot worse from a GDP perspective, from an unemployment rate perspective, and so on. Not many people would tell you that the outcome is going to be as bad as the Great Depression, but I think it's very difficult to play these counterfactual games. And this time around, we've seen perhaps less explicit fiscal stimulus, a lot more monetary stimulus, and the Federal Reserve and others doing a whole lot to address these situations. I think you could very legitimately have had a situation like the Great Depression transpiring if the central bank hadn't stepped in several very major ways. We really could have had a disastrous outcome if those sorts of things hadn't gone through. I'm sure we can still complain about them in a year or two and say, look, a recession happened anyways, but it would have been a lot worse. You could extend that back to the 30s and maybe make that same case.
Let's, in our remaining 8 or so minutes here, consider the New Deal, which is what some are calling what the soon-to-be Obama administration intends to put in place starting next year when President-elect Obama is sworn in. Let's hear from him now. Michael, roll tape, please.
But we need action, and action now. That's why I've asked my economic team to develop an economic recovery plan for both Wall Street and Main Street that will help save or create at least 2.5 million jobs while rebuilding our infrastructure, improving our schools, reducing our dependence on oil, and saving billions of dollars. We won't do it the old Washington way. We won't just throw money at the problem. We'll measure progress by the reforms we make and the results we achieve, by the jobs we create, by the energy we save, by whether America is more competitive in the world.
Lee Ohanian, do you think the incoming administration is on the right track?
I think President-elect Obama's fiscal plan, which ranges in estimates anywhere from $400 billion to perhaps as much as $1 trillion in new federal spending, is a solution in search of a problem. And the reason I say that is it's understandable why the government tried to do a lot in financial markets. You know, there clearly was problems there, and we understand what those are. It's unclear why creating federal jobs now generates an economic recovery. One reason is because every federal job is a job that's paid for by taxpayers. It's unclear whether the various projects and infrastructure he has, whether all of them are ones on which the benefits exceed the costs. It is unclear whether they will be done very efficiently. And perhaps most important, the recession is well underway. A number of the projects he's talking about are very broad in scope. To get those actually underway in a reasonable time frame is a heroic task, and we all know what happens when government projects are rushed. So in my opinion, I don't see this as, I see this as more of a political solution rather than an economic solution to what we're looking at right now.
In which case, Russ Roberts, are we kind of in the midst of the public expects its leaders to do something, and so, damn it, they're going to do something, even if it's not the right thing?
Yeah, I'm always a little bit skeptical of when a politician says we're going to do it differently than it's been done before. There's a certain hubris there and a certain naivete mixed together. I'm sure the current governor of Illinois, when replacing his predecessor who went to jail, said of course he was going to have a clean slate and never be a corrupt governor. Politics is a matter of incentives like everything else. And unfortunately, politicians in America right now are under tremendous pressure to do something. And I agree with Lee. It's not clear it's going to do anything. And the fundamental problem right now isn't stimulating the economy. The fundamental problem right now is that people are very uncertain about the future. So whatever government does, it's going to change those expectations. And my fear is we're going to keep changing them as time goes on in search of trying to do better and continue to paralyze investment, starting of new businesses, expansion. Right now, we're in a period where a lot of businesses are contracting, laying off workers, and a lot of families are contracting and cutting back on expenditures because they're anxious. To me, this doesn't reduce the anxiety. It actually increases it. We're going to have an enormous increase in the federal deficit. Whether we're going to be able to pay for that as cheaply as we have in the past remains a very open question. So I'm concerned.
2.5 minutes to go here, so I'll need brief answers on this. David Kennedy, you know, Paul Krugman says that whatever number the Congress comes up with for its stimulus package, you should probably add 50% to it if you really want to make it work. What do you think?
Well, I think that's probably, even on Krugman's part, a conservative estimate. I think it could be well more than that. But look, let me say something in response to what Lee just said. I don't think there's any very strong reason to presume that the 2.5 million jobs, if that's the number that the Obama policy is trying to stimulate or to create, are going to be government jobs, that people are going to be on the government payroll. I think there's a whole array of means that the government can use to stimulate private investment, tax breaks, tax incentives, and so on and so forth, make the government a consumer of certain kinds of products to stimulate differentiation in product lines and so on. So I don't think that necessarily we're seeing an increase in taxpayer-funded government payrolls.
Eric?
Well, you know what? I think it's a really difficult situation because the key is this has got to be very quick, it's got to be very direct, and it's not clear you can pull that off. Most would say infrastructure is the way to get things out quickly, might not be quick enough. You don't want to make those permanent tax cuts because then you get a structural deficit. That's not desirable at all. I think it's a tough call. It sounds like we'll get it. Sounds like it will help the economy a little bit, but is it money well spent? It's not clear. And the risk, as was noted earlier, is you could end up having to pay a whole lot more for the bonds you issue to fund that, and that could create consequences down the road.
Let me give our last minute here to the Canadian business historian who's going to tell us what lessons President-elect Obama can learn from Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Well, perhaps I like his oratory, I like his personality, but maybe the lessons you should be learning are not from FDR, from Silent Cal Coolidge, who's always been one of my favorite presidents of the 20th century because he didn't do very much.
You know, your conservative stripes are really showing today. You know that, eh? Now that's very interesting because, of course, Roosevelt is the, you know, he is the man in American history. He's in the pantheon, and Silent Cal sure is not.
I visited Silent Cal's gravesite. I haven't visited Roosevelt's.
Pantheons change. Alan Greenspan used to be in the Pantheon until about a year ago.
And then now there's an irrational exuberance to get him off the Pantheon. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, I understand. Can I thank all of our guests for appearing on the program today, starting with our friends in the United States. Russ Roberts from George Mason University, author of The Price of Everything. He came to us out of Washington. David Kennedy, Stanford University, Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, 1929 to 45. He was in Palo Alto, California. Lee Ohanian from University of California at Los Angeles, out of the studios in Westwood, California. Thanks so much to the three of you. And here in our Toronto studio, Eric Lascelles from TD Securities, Joe Martin from the Rotman School of Management at the U of T. And can we also sort of say, welcome home, sort of, Joe. You were on the board of directors of this broadcaster for a long time, and we're glad to have you back in the building.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody very much.